drifting from the gospel and not even know it. How can we tell, and what do we do about it? Well, let's talk about it with author Jared Wilson on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Yeah, this is Steve Brown, etc. This is not Steve Brown, though.
No.
Dr. Brown is away this week, but rest assured, God willing, he will return to us. Next episode, I am Matthew Porter, and I am your humble guest host. Jinx is in the little glass booth. Hello, Jinx.
How are you?
I'm great. I'm excited about this show. Jinx believes there should be a law against blues musicians being a millionaire. You get to that level of success, and
You can't sing the blues anymore.
you've got to either give away the money or you've got to change genres. I'm
Or
like,
just pay the sound guy more.
always that. So, I was at a B.B. King concert, and he's singing "Nobody Loves Me But My Mama." I'm like, bro, there's 50,000 people here. We got to change the message. Our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in the tech bunker in just minutes. John can fix things that sometimes took us years to break. That's what he brings to the table. Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George, if the penny is going away, then how is Key Life going to keep stretching every last cent?
Yeah.
I don't know how those work together.
Well, just send all of them to us.
Yeah.
We'll
sort it out.
Yeah.
That's fair enough.
I think the pennies still exist on paper.
On paper.
It's only in,
Okay.
Yeah, I think you'll find that.
We'll have to go back to the lab on that one.
Yeah.
And Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Since our country seems to find itself in a season of renaming things, Kathy suggested we rename our studio to the Wyatt House. The Wyatt House.
Cheep, 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 cheep.
And
They tell you first day of hosting school, don't end on a pun. So
yeah.
we'll pretend that one didn't. We'll never speak of this
Matthew,
again.
you know, when they're good, they just take the roof off the building.
Big swings, baby.
Big swings. And
Big
when they're
swings.
not great, they just die right
Matt,
there on
sometimes
the
you just got to
floor
put it all
next
on
to me.
red and let it ride.
That's it. That's it.
I did make
The
you
house won tonight.
I made you a coffee cake today, so go down and eat that, okay? That'll make you feel
that'll
better.
make me feel better. I know what'll make us feel better. Talking to Jared Wilson.
For sure.
He is a good friend of the show and has graciously returned. Jared Wilson serves as assistant professor of pastoral ministry and author in residence at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's also staff pastor for preaching and director of the Pastoral Training Center at Liberty Baptist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. Sorry about the Chiefs, by the way. Let's not get into that. Jared is also a podcaster and has written more than 20 books. That's a lot of books. And his latest is right here in my nicotine stained hands. I'll leave the phrases to Steve. It's called Lest We Drift: 5 Departure Dangers from the One True Gospel. Jared, thanks for coming back.
It is always good to be with you. It's good to be with the etc. today.
Yeah,
Yes.
you know, you show up and you're like, Steve isn't here. It's like you go to a party and you're like, somebody brought Czech Cola. Well, you know,
Still bubbles.
it still works. We'll make this work. So, no,
It's all right. Steve's always trying to get me in trouble. You know,
Yeah.
I've been coming on y'all's program. I was thinking about it this morning for over 10 years. I mean,
Yeah.
my first time was back when I was pastoring in Vermont, which was
Yes.
It's on you at
I've
this
been
point.
I've been in Kansas City 10 years now, so that was more than 10 years ago.
Wow.
And I remember he was trying to get me to talk bad about my church people, and it's not, this guy's going to get me in trouble someday. But I keep coming back for more. So.
Yeah.
Slow learner.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Well, I'm really excited about this book because it's oriented in one sense towards preachers, pastors, church leadership, but not exclusively at all. I found myself at several points going, "Oh shoot, I gotta chew on that for a little while." So let's dive into it. Just frame up the problem for us of gospel drift, and you do that in the first couple chapters. And it's funny, as you did that, you kind of bring us through a couple of historical milestones in the Christian culture, and I'm at several points. I'm like, I remember that. I remember when we did this. So it was like a trip through memory lane a little bit. Paint the picture for us, would you?
Yeah, well, the impetus behind wanting to explore this approach to gospel drift was really just my own experience in the so-called gospel-centered movement, what used to be called the Young Restless Reformed. None of us are young anymore, so we don't really call it that anymore. But the rise over the last, say early to mid 2000s, the last 20 some years of resurgence in Reformed theology and recommitment to historic Protestantism and things like that, and just the cultural tribal conference circuit publishing glut, all of that came out of that, and then it just seemed to peter out, and not just peter out, but in some ways become more tribal, kind of balkanized. And so part of it was just wanting to analyze like what happened to this thing. We've seen some kind of postmortems like Mike Cosper's Rise and Fall of Mars Hill and things like that. But the deeper I got into sort of inspecting the movements, fracturing, the more I realized, number one, it's not really monocausal. That it's a more complex thing than I think, those who are on social media would sometimes like to admit. It's very easy to just say, this is what, here's the issue. And if you just, would follow, my 5-step, plan,
Right.
we can get it back.
Ideally, it's an acrostic that we could all remember.
Yeah, that's right.
easily.
That's right. It
It's
spells
not
a
too
word
much
or
trouble.
something.
Yeah, we have a Baptist background. We kind of have expectations on this.
Right. Yeah. So, some alliteration or something.
Yes.
But I quickly realized, first of all, the goal is not to get some kind of movement back, because movements come and go. These things fluctuate with just subcultural emphases, and the problem is not that we've lost some conference or some sort of tribal affiliations with publishing and those sorts of things. The problem is what happens to the church and what happens to evangelicals when we take our eyes off the good news of Jesus. And so this has been a theme of mine and of my ministry for at least the last 20 years. So wanting to look at it from a biblical perspective, number one, these are things Jesus warned us about, and these are things that the apostles warned us about, but also just sort of stump again for the concept of gospel centrality to help people understand the gospel law distinction, that the law cannot do what the gospel does, and really take another run at not trying to recapture a movement, but to kind of get back to the heart of the good news and to see if we can warn ourselves about what drifting from focusing on the good news, might cost us as Christians.
So yeah, when the gospel centrality, that kind of, like you said, it kind of, there was an apex of when that was kind of in the zeitgeist, but that was preceded by other movements, other trends. The seeker friendly thing, which I was there for that. There was like a service on Rachel, and we're like, okay, and then the band sings Roxanne. Literally, I'm like, God, this is so
I believe it.
weird.
I might have been at that church.
Yeah. I'm like, I love the Police. I love the gospel. This isn't mathing for me, but okay. So we did that, and then there was, you said the emergent movement. I'm like, that felt like that was almost in parallel with the emo thing. You're like kind of, and then we're on to the next thing. So it is tricky because, so coming out of those, we do kind of a course correction and a gospel centrality. But as soon as you put, like you said, you put a label on it, there's an expiration date as far as when people are kind of talking about it, which is bad because we kind of need to keep that in the crosshairs for the whole time. So once people are moving on to the next thing, problematic. So like you said, not trying to recapture any magic or anything, but just realign back to what it's all about. And you put this really well in the book where intellectually everybody would assent to this, but the rub comes when it comes to the application, right? Of the gospel centrality, and that's where everybody starts to split up, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not. I like the phrase gospel centered. I like using gospel as an adjective. Despite the fact that it's a noun. I'm not opposed to those things. My concern is that we actually understand what gospel centered means, and I'm convinced a great number of people who even identified with the gospel centered movement never really knew, or at least only had a cursory grasp of actually what that actually means to be gospel centered. So that's a huge emphasis in the book as well, is just trying to explain what it actually means beyond the buzzword, beyond the jargon.
And in fact, some of them
actually mean?
Have proven out to have gone in different directions.
Yes.
Post proclaiming that very vociferously. So we will get into that on the other side of the break. I said it before, but I'll say it again. This is not just for pastors or church leadership. This is for everyday people, because you're going to read through this and you go, oh, I've seen that over there. Oh, I've seen that in oh, shoot, I might have seen this in my church. Oh, I might have seen this mindset maybe in my own life. This is a bracing and challenging book, a prophetic word at the crossroads of culture and theology. You are going to love it. Stick with us for the whole time. We are going to be right back. Thanks for joining us on Steve Brown, Etc. We are talking to Jared Wilson. His latest book is called Lest We Drift, 5 Departure Dangers from the One True Gospel. Before the break, we were kind of still teeing up what the problem is, and we were discussing kind of off air. There's kind of a lot of nuance to it, because you would say, let's be gospel-centered, and nobody's going to say no to that. So the problem is not everybody buying in on it conceptually, but what does it look like when it fleshes out? So could you give us a working definition of being gospel-centered and talk about, where does this drift appear and show up?
Yeah, so I like to essentially explain gospel centrality through 3 major implications. So my students at the seminary, my residents at our church, when someone asks them, if they go pastor somewhere, go lead somewhere, and someone says to them, "Pastor, what does it mean to be gospel-centered?" They're not giving some, self-redundant answer like, it means to center everything on the gospel, which is usually what people say.
Thank you, Tyler.
What does it mean to be gospel-centered? It means to orient everything around the gospel. Well, thanks. That's literally what it means. But what does it mean on the ground? What does it mean for practice and for faith? And so I've outlined 3 essential elements that give us the substance of gospel centrality. And the first one is that the whole Bible is about Jesus. Old and New Testament, that the whole thing is about Jesus. It culminates in him. It points to him. It is in the Old Testament giving us the types and shadows that are helping us to yearn. It's training us to yearn for him, to long for him. And in the New Testament, the lights are turned on and are showing us the full revelation of Christ himself. Now, this element is less controversial today than I think it would have been in the garden variety evangelical church probably 30 years ago. But I did not grow up in a church where this was the case. When I say this to students today, they're like, well, yeah, of course. But when I was their age, nobody was telling me the whole Bible's about Jesus. The Old Testament is, God being mean, and the New Testament, Jesus shows up and God's nice now. It's like a functional Marcionism of some kind. Or we would take the Bible and turn it into, 5, helpful tips for successful living or something like that.
Right.
And so it's really the work of biblical theology, just to see the through line of Scripture culminating in Jesus. The second element of gospel centrality is that people change by grace and not by law. So answering the question, how is it that people change, which is what the church is in the business of, and certainly what ministry leaders are in the business of, helping people change. Well, how does that come about? And this is more provocative than the first element still today, because in our flesh, we yearn for law, and we just have this instinctual, intuitive sense that the way people change is by telling them to change.
Right. Sounds like a Tyler answer again.
Yeah, right. We know how people change. You tell them
Change.
And when that doesn't work,
I've been trying
we say
way
it
too
louder. And we bring in consequences or rewards. Like, it's some variation
Yes.
of legal maneuvering,
Right.
bringing the law to bear. And no, what we learn actually biblically is the way people change, at least at the heart level. I mean, you can affect, behavior modification if you crack the whip of the law hard enough. But at the level where it really counts, at the heart level, people change by grace. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, we are transformed from one degree of glory into another by beholding the glory of Jesus. Titus chapter 2, where Paul says it's grace that trains us to renounce ungodliness. The appearance of grace that does that. So it's trying to get, especially for those who preach and teach, but just believers in general in their household, in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, to understand that the way people are actually transformed, the way people change, is by hearing good news, by seeing the grace of God. And then the third element of the substance of gospel centrality is more personal, but it's basically my ultimate validation is not found in my performance, but Christ's performance on my behalf. So it's really kind of making personal the doctrine of imputation, perhaps, that I'm before God, I am every day justified. I wasn't just justified at the point of my conversion, and then 10 years into my Christian life, I'm waking up and God is saying, "All right, impress me. Show me what you got today." No, I wake up into His favor because of Jesus, and I go to bed at night, whatever has happened that day, and I might have been a huge dirtbag, but I go to bed at night into the favor of God because of Jesus. And this obviously has huge implications for how we do ministry, that our validation is not in how the church is doing, growing, successful, etc. But it keeps us from despair when things are not going well, that, the Lord's not sort of putting our performance on some kind of grand balance and, trying to, see how well we can do. But we are loved unconditionally. We are accepted in Jesus Christ. And, man, this was a huge turning point for me.
Yeah.
It's kind of why I am about this stuff the way I am about this stuff now, is because I was suicidal, depressed, marriage was broken, life was over as far as I knew, had no hope. And the message that I heard in this little guest bedroom in Nashville, Tennessee, when I wanted to kill myself one night, was not some new revelation. It was this old message that I heard since I was a kid. I just didn't realize it was for me. I didn't know the gospel was for Christians. I thought it was just for non-Christians. And then once you had it, you move on to some,
Other
to deeper
stuff.
things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it changed my life. It woke me up.
That's beautiful. That does sound like something you want to keep central.
Yeah. Jared, and it, talk about coming from sort of the excitement of that discovery. And then, I don't know if it's jumping too far ahead, but in one of the risk of drifting in the chapter on less than delight, and I don't know if we need to pick up on the other side, but one of the sentences really struck me was one of the biggest dangers facing Christians today is flat out boredom with the gospel. And I wonder, especially contrasting from, your discovery of that exciting, life-saving, life-giving experience, and then going to boredom. I mean, where does that risk, sorry, where does that risk come up? How do we get there? Is that, by the way, one of the 7 deadly sins, the acedia?
Acedia, yeah.
Talk about that maybe on the other side?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that.
That was a great tee up. Listen, we're talking about drifting from the gospel. When you're in the car, and the car drifts, you've got that little you got that, or the fancy ones have the little system that says, "Hey, dummy, wake up," or whatever. Wow, what happens when we drift from the gospel? How do we know? Well, we're going to get into that on the other side of the break, and as we just talked about briefly, we're going to get into some of the specifics, and we get into the specifics of how we drift. I think it's going to start being a lot more tactical, and you're going to go, "Oh, okay, I get it. I've seen that. Oh my, I was at a church that did that." That's the warning system that we want to have in place to keep us centered up. The book is called Lest We Drift, 5 Departure Dangers from the One True Gospel. We're talking to Jared Wilson, and we will be right back. You are listening to Steve Brown, etc., and we are hanging out with one of our favorite folks, Jared Wilson. Keep up with him on the internets at jaredcwilson.com and on X and Instagram at Jared C. Wilson. Before the break, George had a really great question. If you want to tee that back up, and let's hit this.
Okay, yeah, just quickly, the quote that stood out to me, one of the biggest dangers facing Christians today is flat out boredom with the gospel. And that stood out, especially you had just talked about this renewal experience that you had and kind of the excitement with that. How does that get to the point of boredom?
Yeah, it gets to the point of boredom, I think, when we hold the gospel merely as an idea or an ideology, and we don't have the spiritual vitality that seeing the glory of Jesus in the gospel actually nurtures in us. One of the most common questions that I get as I do ministry coaching, particularly as it relates to preaching, the most common question I think is, okay, you're saying I need to preach the gospel in every sermon from every text, etc. How do I do that in a way that doesn't sound one note, or that doesn't sound like I'm just beating the same drum every single week, etc.? And there is an exegetical or even a homiletical answer to that question, which is to say that the gospel is not a one note. It's one song, but it's not one note. And the beauty of the scriptures is that it gives us multiple angles on the good news. There's things you can highlight within Christ's saving work, whether it's adoption one week and justification proper the next week, and the facets of the atonement. I mean, it's a beautiful diamond. But oftentimes I think the question, belies not like, okay, I need some hermeneutical, handholds for this. I need some help looking at the different facets of the good news. I think it belies that they personally do not see the excitement in the good news of Jesus, that I'm a sinner who stands condemned, and God sent his son. I mean, can you believe that? He sent his son to die for me in my place? That blows my mind. And I think we get to a point of the gospel is this theology, and we're not saved by a level of emotionality about the gospel. We're saved by Jesus' work that's announced, to us in the gospel. So you can have a dry faith if it's a real faith, but at the same time, the reason why we don't think it will work, and the reason why we think it needs to be shored up by so much law, and the reason why we think we need smoking lasers and everything else, is because we do not see ourselves personally how exciting and glorious the good news is. And so we think, well, certainly people are going to get bored by this. And people do get bored by it. That's a problem we run into, especially for those who are committed to gospel centrality, is you will have people very, quote unquote, helpfully say to you, hey, we need something
A little different.
we need some more like razzle dazzle, you know? And you think, oh, I certainly don't want people to be upset with me or to be disgruntled. So we try to razzle dazzle it up. And I think that all comes from a heart and mind that's not captivated with just how amazing the good news is. Because once you have been sort of undone by this announcement, it's almost like, what else is there?
What else is there to talk about? And you
Yeah,
have this-
everything else just looks so puny compared to this.
You have such a great quote on this subject. It says, if the gospel is big enough to be the grounds for our salvation for all eternity, surely it will be enough for a lifetime of Sundays. Like, there it is. Drop mic.
Jared, I wanted to just dive in just a little bit to chapter 5, which you titled Less Than Deep, and the subtitle is Adrift into Superficiality. And I love that you ended that chapter with a quote from Tim Keller, which is right down the line of what you were just talking about, where he said, because the gospel is endlessly rich, it can handle the burden of being the one main thing of a church. Superficiality, that would be something that like with anything else, one particular church would think that a certain thing would be very superficial as far as the weekly services and that kind of thing, and another would not think that was the case. How do we hone that in, if that's the right terminology, to determine what is it that we're doing in our particular church that has taken the gospel and made it superficial, or even almost to the point of removing it from the service. You can't, and we're going to come up on a break, so we're going to have to go the other side of it, but you can't just say that it's only a stylistic thing. In other words, if you have a real contemporary kind of thing, that's when that happens, versus if you have a real, the opposite end of the spectrum. I don't know that I think that that's it, but something's happening someplace along the line. Take it away, Matthew.
Yes. Great question. We'll hit that on the other side of the break, and also get into, we've talked about some of the departures from the gospel, but how can we tell when we're drifting? And then maybe more importantly, what do we do about it? We'll get to that on the other side of the break with Jared Wilson. Hey, by the way, I mentioned Jared's social. He's a good follow. Find him on Twitter and socials. When you see a picture of him with some cool kicks and an awesome travel bag, you know that he is flying somewhere to share the good news. We will share some more good news with you on the other side of the break. Don't go anywhere. Thank you for spending time with us here on Steve Brown, etc. By the way, do you know about SBE Insider? It's a special playlist on YouTube that features some of the hilarious and profound off-air conversations that we have here on this very show. But don't go searching for it, because you won't find it. It's available only to the folks who get our free weekly email, which is called Key Life Connection. So if I have sufficiently intrigued you, then go to keylife.org/subscribe and try it out today.
Is that bribery?
It's inducement. I don't
there
know.
You go.
It's worth it, I promise. It's totally worth
Before we
it.
get to manipulation.
If I had money, I would bribe. I'm not above it at all. Kathy, you had an intriguing question before the break.
I did, and I'll make it really, really short. And I was referring to chapter 5, Less Than Deep, the subtitle, Adrift into Superficiality. And I just wanted you to kind of get into that a little bit. How do we... where do we go to decide what that is and what that is not? And I thought it was, again, just the repeat on the Keller. You ended with Tim Keller's quote, because the gospel is endlessly rich, it can handle the burden of being the one main thing of church, which I think is cool and kind of summarizes everything that you were saying in the last segment.
Yeah, no, I think, the superficiality that we see, as a temptation really boils down to a couple of things. One is, in line with the Keller quote, that we don't see the gospel as deep. We see it as the initial kind of elementary steps into Christianity. But then once you're in, you move on to things that are deeper. And, when I was a kid growing up in church, we actually called them that. We called it, deeper teaching or deeper things. And depending on the church or even the time, the season, cultural season we were in, those deeper things were always changing,
Yeah.
For a long time it was eschatology and not just, really biblical eschatology, but sort of the timing of the Lord's return and sort of cultural questions about, is the beast a supercomputer in Sweden that has all of our social security numbers, all those, all of those sorts of things. It was a preoccupation.
Was that a yes or no? I didn't get it.
News flash, sorry. But maybe it is. I don't know. It was stuff like that, or it was the Calvinism, Arminianism debate, or it could be all sorts of things. But we never, considered that maybe the good news of Jesus is actually deeper than we think it is. Maybe it's not just the grounds of our justification, but also the power of our sanctification as well. And so we treat the gospel as kind of a one-note thing. And that certainly then ties into the second way we kind of engage in superficiality is just how we treat the Bible itself. So when someone is preaching, a sermon or teaching a lesson or doing a discipleship encounter of some kind, the way they use the Bible betrays whether they think the good news is there versus needing to be tacked on. And so, when you, for instance, are in a church service where there's a 35-minute sermon that is essentially wall-to-wall law. Here are 4 ways to be a better, parent, spouse, worker, whatever. It's a self-help approach to the scriptures, and it's using the Bible, but it's not engaging with the scriptures in a deep way to draw out that the good news is there, which is the gospel-centered way to, understand the Bible. And so we just sort of skip along the surface of kind of behavior modification. And, the way that we sometimes engage in preaching and teaching is like we're using the Bible, but we're not really preaching the Bible. Because if we were preaching the Bible, we would see just how brimming it is with grace. But we don't get there because we just sort of stay on the surface of, helping people change by law. And I think those are, probably the 2 biggest tells is treating the gospel like it's, oh yeah, of course the gospel, it's like the wallpaper in the room, but not the furniture kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or the way we treat the Bible as sort of this, resource for, life improvement rather than as this living encounter with the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ.
Right.
Yeah, and the way you've laid it out, once you see these 5 departures, once you see these tells, it's like seeing Waldo. You're like, now I can't not see it. It's
Right.
You're like, I have brushed up against this before, but now I kind of have a name for what it is. So practically speaking, if someone wanted to share this, a layperson wants to share this with a pastor, is there any possible way that can be, like, hey, here you go, and then they get it, and they're like, oh, I'm drifting? Is that what you're saying? I'm that guy? Is there any way to do that without getting somebody defensive on this thing? Because it's a great book and everybody needs to read it.
Yeah, everybody's different. Pastors can be very defensive. I received a text message this morning that immediately had me on the defense.
and understandably, pastors have like a million things, so you kind of like wake
well, it's
up.
Monday morning, wait till Tuesday at least.
Yes, yes.
No, it was, I when I was able to sort of not be in reactive mode, I thought, you know what, I should appreciate that they actually approached me with the concern rather than started talking to 1,000 other people about it. And which is, sometimes the case where people, they don't come to the pastor, they actually just start talking about it. No, as a guy who wants to sell a lot of books, yeah, sure, for sure, give the book to your pastor. But maybe a more gentle way would be not just to come in with an accusation or an allegation, but to come in with honest questions. Can you help me understand? I know that I'm put a little more at ease, or I'm disarmed a little bit when someone comes and says, I'm just struggling to understand why we're doing it this way. Can you
Yeah.
help me understand? Rather than coming and saying we're doing it wrong, or you're doing it wrong, or you need to fix things. But you can come in with a kind of meekness, which is not agendaless. It's not that you're not trying to communicate a concern, but you can do it in a way that has an openness, that has a meekness to it. That's actually more effective than if you came in kind of with your dukes up.
Yeah, you're coming kind of alongside on the same side of the table. I think, yes, that kind of diffuses it on the front end quite a bit. There's so many great quotes, as I had said before. There's one before, just one last one. As we fill our appetites with all the offerings available to us in our church programs and through books, conferences, podcasts, social media, let us take great care that we do not become drunkenly neglectful of our soul's need for grace. Just thought that's a beautiful summation on the sufficiency of the gospel. Anything to add to that?
No, I mean,
Nothing
I
to
just
add.
wanna
That's the whole point.
say you guys. I mean, everything else in the book I added to that, I guess.
Yeah.
But I know we got 3 seconds left. I just want to say it's refreshing to come on a program like this, where this is not a foreign language, where we can talk about the desire for grace, and people are like, "Oh yeah, grace is sweet," but you guys get it, and that makes me feel at home, and I appreciate that, and I hope your listeners appreciate that this is a place that gets grace.
We try to. We've been blessed, and we've sure been blessed by having you with us on the show today. We've been talking to Jared Wilson, and the book is called Lest We Drift, 5 Departure Dangers from the One True Gospel. I'll tell you how I know this is a good book. I bought a copy at retail to give to a pastor friend. I don't pay retail for nothing. Nothing. Amazon said it costs this much. I'm like, sold. I'm not gonna even debate it. Just take the money, Amazon. So, hey, listen, we got one more segment on the other side of this break. Stick with us. Bless your heart. You've spent an entire hour with us here on Steve Brown, etc., and we sure do appreciate it. Hey, let me paint a picture for you. You're at the gym. You're slowly dying at the DMV. You're commuting to work. Basically, you got some available listening time. These would be great opportunities to dial up our podcast called Simply Sermons. You can find it for free in our Key Life app. You can find it on your favorite podcast platform or at keylife.org/Simply Sermons. How great was that conversation with Jared?
Oh, terrific.
I always love talking to him, and he's a smart dude.
Yeah. It would have been interesting to hear him comment just in terms of how it relates to different worship styles. I mean, Kathy was kind of suggesting it. But, I mean, we see the full range of what we call contemporary that actually has almost become traditional, and then traditional, which is unique or whatever. But, I mean, obviously, the gospel can be preached in any of those settings, but is one a little riskier than another for this drift element? Would have been interesting to hear some commentary on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wished we'd had a little bit more time with that, because I think sometimes people make the assumption, whether rightly or wrongly, that when you drift over into the more contemporary side, which some people would describe as entertainment, that you lose the ability to be able to communicate what's, and again, you kind of fall into the point of saying what's really important, that being the gospel. But it's you have to be really careful with whichever, because people are obviously being ministered to on both sides of the fence.
Yeah. Well, I think he had touched on that beautifully, where it really comes back to, are you captured by the gospel? Are you enamored of it? That people won't model what a pastor teaches. The people will model what the pastor is passionate about. And if you don't feel like that's enough, then you're like, well, and like we talked about off air, if Jesus is good, then Jesus plus how to do this in 5 steps is better, right? That adds
Yeah.
up, and that math don't math, as the young kids say, and it kind of sometimes leads down some really weird roads.
Or are you enamored by the flash and the entertainment? Or on the flip side, are you enamored by the liturgy?
Right.
You know, I mean, it can be either way.
Yeah,
for sure.
there's some you can get distracted by bad stuff and by almost everything. Yeah.
We're going to mess it up either way.
Yeah, exactly. But Jesus will love us anyway. Who's our next guest, Kat?
John Eldridge.
Oh,
Our
man.
friend John Eldridge
I love John
experienced Jesus really with the longest subtitle in the history
Bring
of
it.
Christian books, Finding Refuge, Strength, and Wonder Through Everyday Encounters with God. Phew, I almost didn't get that in.
That Eldridge.
Almost chapter 1 by itself.
I know, right? That's
Join
the
us for
introduction
that.
right there.
Yeah, you know it's going to be a good time. So join us next week with John Eldridge. In the meantime, remember, be safe, and stay dangerous.
Had my subtitle triggering.